Snow pressed against the Kremlin walls that night, muffling the world in silence. Inside, beneath a single hanging lamp, Joseph Stalin prepared a game board, black oak and ivory, gleaming like a relic from another age. 6 officers stood before him, summoned without explanation. They had survived the purges, but survival under Stalin was never safety. He didn't greet them, didn't look up, just said, in that low, measured tone that froze men mid-breath, "Comrades, we will play a game." The words hung in the air. No one moved. Stalin gestured to the chessboard. A game of logic, of patience, of loyalty. The nearest officer sat, his hand trembling as he reached for a pawn. Stalin made the first move, a small, soft click on the board that echoed like a gunshot in the still room. "I find," he murmured, "that a man's true nature is revealed in silence." Outside, the Kremlin clock struck midnight. The echo rolled through the halls, cold and hollow. The officers stood frozen, realizing that this was no pastime. This was a test, and in Stalin's world, even a game of chess could decide who lived and who disappeared by morning. The room smelled of tobacco, sweat, and fear. The chessboard gleamed like a battlefield under the single lamp. Stalin watched silently, but in his mind, he saw the ghosts of those who once stood where these officers now sat. Generals, marshals, and commissars who had vanished in the purges. He tapped the table softly. The nearest general flinched. "Tell me," Stalin said, his voice low, "do you ever think about them?" The officer froze. "The ones who are gone." "Yes, the ones who are gone." A long silence. "Only to learn from their mistakes," the officer whispered. Stalin's faint smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Mistakes are very educational." He moved a knight. The horse's carved face caught the light like a shadow. Every officer understood. The chessboard was a mirror, but the real game was inside their heads. A pause, a twitch, a misstep, and they might end up like those ghosts. Another piece moved. Another silence fell. Stalin's gaze landed on the young colonel. "Let us see how well he plays." And in that moment, the room held its breath. Every man knew survival depended on fear, composure, and cunning, even before the first check. The game began just after midnight. The lamp above the chessboard flickered, casting shadows that danced like silent spectators. The colonel's hands trembled. Every move felt heavier than the last. Every glance at Stalin carried invisible consequences. The dictator's first moves were calm, deliberate, precise, yet they weren't really about chess. He was testing instincts, patience, composure, watching for hesitation, for micro-expressions, for fear that could betray a man before a word was spoken. The colonel moved a knight. "Careful," Stalin said, almost amused. "Boldness is courage, but recklessness." He let the sentence hang in the air, the threat implied. The pieces clicked, sliding across the board. Each movement echoed in the officers' minds. One officer coughed. Stalin's gaze shifted. A single glance froze him. Coughing is either sickness or guilt, Stalin said. The colonel's pulse thundered as he tried to focus on the board. He realized, too late, the truth. This wasn't a game of strategy. It was a test of survival. Then Stalin's knight captured the colonel's queen. The colonel's eyes widened. He had misread the board. But it didn't matter. Stalin's eyes weren't on the board. They were on him. "You look surprised," Stalin whispered. "Do you think the rules don't change when I decide they do?" The colonel nodded weakly. "Of course not, Comrade Stalin." "Good," Stalin said, "because life under me is not a game of rules. It's a game of survival." The game stretched into the early hours. The room was heavy with silence. Every movement, every breath was amplified. The colonel's hands shook. The pieces blurred under the lamp's glow. He reached for his rook and froze. Stalin's voice cut through the quiet. "Do you know what separates a leader from a pawn?" The colonel hesitated. "Strategy, Comrade Stalin?" "No, trust," Stalin said, leaning closer. "And I trust no one." He moved his bishop. Check. The colonel's throat went dry. Every officer knew the board was only part of the test. The true danger was in their minds. Hesitation could cost them far more than a game. A desperate move. Another pause. Stalin smirked, observing every flicker of doubt. Then his queen swept across the board. Checkmate. The colonel understood. He hadn't lost because of skill. He had lost because he hesitated. Stalin stood, slow and deliberate. In war, in politics, in life, hesitation is death. Remember that. He smiled thinly, the smile of a man who had won without breaking a sweat. "This was only a game, Colonel. But next time, I may not be playing." The room remained frozen long after he left. The chessboard was still. The officers were not. They had survived the night, but the fear would follow them forever. Morning arrived over Moscow, pale and cold. The city moved on, unaware of the silent battle that had taken place inside the Kremlin walls. The colonel hadn't slept. He stared at the chessboard, his king trapped, his queen gone. He tried to tell himself it was just a game, but he knew better. Every glance, every gesture, every word from now on would be measured against what Stalin had seen that night. He had survived, but only just. The officers around him were no different. They carried invisible scars, knowing that talent, courage, or intelligence couldn't protect them. Only vigilance, composure, and an understanding of fear could. Weeks later, subtle changes began. Invitations stopped. Messages ceased. Boots in the hallway became a silent announcement. The colonel understood. Survival under Stalin was never guaranteed. The game had ended, but the test had not. Years later, after Stalin's death, a janitor would find that chessboard. Half the pieces were missing. On the underside, carved deep into the wood, was a single phrase: "Trust is the first move toward defeat." Even the board had borne witness. And the lesson of that night, fear, control, and survival, would linger forever.